Hi, I'm Chris Howard, and welcome to Top of Mind. This is a really interesting time of year. We're in the midst of so many big Gartner conferences, our IT symposium, our HR Reimagined, and a number of other events that are taking place over the end of the year. And what I've been watching for is to say, well, what are clients really doing? What are they struggling with? What are they planning for 2024? And something becomes very clear because AI is still such a dominant topic across all of these conferences, is that people are really starting to move from a period of long experimentation in 2023 and preparing for more of a implementation year in 2024. And the numbers here are quite interesting. If I look across my clients, not 100%, but a large number, like north of 90%, have been doing that experimentation, but only about 10% say that they're moving into some kind of a scaled production. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of the reasons that are keeping people from moving quickly into production. It's not that they don't believe the value of generative AI and AI technologies. It's just they've realized that it's harder to do, perhaps, than they thought it was going to be. So winter has come. One of the examples here is grounding. So grounding we've talked about before. This is the technique that you use to create a more accurate generated response by grounding it in your own data. So the large language models, the big horizontal language models, teach the system how to speak. What grounding does is it teaches the system what to speak about. So you're using your specific data in that instance. The actual technique of doing that actually takes a lot of work and lots of experiments in terms of how do I create even more accuracy. And there's interesting innovation happening in the input and output filtering of prompt engineering, which is creating more detail in terms of validation within the prompt itself. And what's happening, of course, is the accuracy is getting better, but a lot of executives are still concerned about, does this have to be 100% accurate? What cases can I use it for? What should I not use it for? And so there's some clarity coming with the experimentation, but it's still really hard to do. Another thing that clients are starting to question are the productivity claims around generative AI. Now, there's no question that in certain use cases, we're seeing significant productivity gains, like in things like code generation or even just creation of materials that are used, say, for marketing purposes, those types of things. But what we're looking for is like real data about what that productivity is. And is there something different about artificial intelligence that changes the calculus of productivity that actually makes an exponential change? That's one of the things that Gartner is going to be looking at in 2024. Something else that our clients are experiencing is that as they move from experimentation to implementation, experimentation was often done by tiger teams or people that were doing it kind of in extra time. But we're moving into a much more dedicated teaming environment where maybe you require a center of excellence or some other change in the way that you operate in order to make the use of these technologies efficient. So this is something that happens with technologies all the time. So we're in this transition phase to say, well, how should people work differently when machines are actually part of the team? How do you operate differently? And trying to come to terms with that, which may mean some hiring or some restructuring in order to create that team that is specifically dedicated. The other thing about that operating model is it needs to be cross the enterprise because so many different parties within the enterprise are trying to figure out how to use AI within their function, within their products, within IT itself. And so this team really needs to span the entire enterprise. Regulation. This itself is a big topic, and it seems like there's news about this every day, every week. Recently, we had in the US an executive order. There are laws coming in Canada, in the UK, and other places. And so many companies are kind of hesitant to see, well, how are those regulations going to shake out so that I know that I'm working within the boundaries of what is deemed to be safe and responsible. So that causes a little muting of the innovation, kind of waiting for the regulations and policy to be put in place. Just a word about regs and policy. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and interacting with governments over the last several months. Regulation and policies are actually essential for innovation because it carves out the space within which you can operate. And knowing where you're going to stay safe or where you're going to cross that line is actually very helpful in terms of experiments and scoping use cases that you're going to pursue. So keep an eye on this space, and we'll certainly talk more about it as regulations come into focus. Security. Another reason why there's some hesitance to move from experimentation into production, part of that is the regs and policy. But actually, when you're using AI, and especially generative AI, some new things emerge as either attack vectors or risk vectors. Things like model drift, whereas the model as it's being used, the data actually starts to drift and become less useful potentially, or potentially more dangerous. There are more nefarious things like model poisoning, where model gets injected with perhaps intentionally fake information, and then it actually changes the whole dynamic of the model itself. And so there are techniques within model ops and the emerging LLM ops. So at the time of development, you're building more secure and models that are less burdened with bias, those types of things. But this whole attack surface of model from development to runtime is an emerging space that people need to get their arms around. Related to that, of course, is responsible AI, knowing how decisions get made, being able to track and do attestation. Generative AI isn't really great for those types of things yet. But what that means is that there's a whole lot of innovation happening inside the prompt engineering space where you can actually use techniques to validate the sources that were cited, perhaps, or to interrogate the generated output before it actually goes live in generated output. There's a whole lot of interesting innovation happening there that we're also covering. And then finally, the biggest question that my clients have is, what's the value of all of this? What's the value that's going to be produced by applying these technologies? And this value comes in multiple forms. Sometimes it is actually creating a new revenue stream, or it is reducing the amount of effort required to produce something, so the margin becomes richer. Certainly those productivity gains that we talked about earlier. But there are other values that we're pursuing here that may be social values. So things around diversity and equality, and things like healthcare or education, those are a form of value. And so what we're doing at Gartner is actually trying to articulate those different types of value and how they line up with use cases. And that'll be a big part of what we're doing over the next several months here at Gartner. So to recap, what we're seeing is that maybe the new car smell has started to come off of generative AI, which we expected. And that's is fine, because what happens is when hype burns off, it settles into the trough of disillusionment. And you've heard me talk about that trough as simply being the place where work begins. And I can tell you that across my client base, this is exactly what I'm seeing, is that the work is beginning. What Gartner's going to do is try to help there in terms of deep implementation advice, which becomes very technical, but also strategic advice in terms of how best to apply it and what kind of value to expect. We've created a new framework for you to use that I'm going to introduce here, but we'll talk about more in some detail in a future episode. And it's called an AI Ambition Radar. Very simple tool, which you can use to say, where do my use cases fall and where am I going to apply what we're calling everyday AI? So things for automation and back office, perhaps, but also game-changing AI. What are those things that AI enables that you've never been able to do before that creates an exponential value? So more to come on that. I want to encourage you to keep experimenting, but also choose those places where implementation seems likely to produce value. Think about everyday AI and game-changing AI, and share what you're doing with us and with your peers so that we can evolve together as a tech community in the application of this very important technology. I'm Chris Howard. This has been Top of Mind. Thanks for joining me today.